September 1909. A log cabin in Virginia burns to the ground. Inside, 6 members of the same family lie dead, their skulls crushed by an axe. The fire was set to conceal the crime. A man was convicted and sent to the electric chair, but he never confessed. Just weeks later, 80 miles away, another family was murdered and their house burned. Were these the acts of 2 separate murderers, or the work of a shadowy serial killer known only as the Man from the Train? You're listening to the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, bringing you compelling true crime stories from the Appalachian Mountains and beyond. I'm your host, Alfred Dockery. Grab your hat and a lantern, and let's get on the trail. The Laurel Creek Murders. Late on the night of September 21st, 1909, someone murdered 6 members of the Meadows family and set their log cabin on fire near Hurley, a small community in Buchanan County, Virginia, the only county in the state that borders both West Virginia and Kentucky. According to newspaper accounts, telephone and telegraph communications with the town were limited and slow, making it difficult to obtain detailed information about the story. Additionally, Hurley was on a narrow-gauge railroad, a fact that, as you will see, becomes important later. The slayings have been referred to by several names: the Meadows family murders, the Justus and Meadows family murders, or most commonly, the Laurel Creek murders. Among the dead were Elizabeth Aunt Betty Justus, 66, her son-in-law George Meadows, 27, her daughter Lydia Meadows, 23, and the couple's 3 children, Noah, 8, Will, 6, and Lafayette, 2. Each one had been struck in the head with an axe or hatchet. The crime scene was something out of a nightmare. The best description we have comes from a letter by W.L. Dennis, former Buchanan County clerk, which was published in the Roanoke World News a week after the crime. Here are some of his observations. It looked as if the head of Mrs. Justus had been cut off by an axe or hatchet, and had been cut crosswise, laying some 2 or 3 feet from the body, and it looked as though the head of one of the others had been cut off. George Meadows had been struck in the back of the neck with something like a hatchet, and fell about 30 feet from the cabin door. They shot him twice in the right side, about 2 inches apart. He had on his pants or overalls, and 1 shoe, and 1 suspender on, as if he had just been putting his clothes on. He had a pencil in his hand, or near him, as though he might have been trying to write down the names of those who committed the murder, but if he did, it was burned up. Dennis went on to say that a family living within sight of the cabin reported hearing Meadows yell for help once or twice. They also heard a woman scream and a baby cry after they heard the shots. About 1 a.m. they saw the flames and gave the alarm. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the incident was that somehow 2-year-old Lafayette either got out or was carried out of the cabin, but crawled back into the door and was killed by the fire. Killed for cash? Early on, officials and the press concluded that robbery was the motive, as Aunt Betty was known to keep large amounts of cash at home. Some sources suggest that she had about $1,600 on hand, about $55,000 in today's money. The afternoon after the bodies were found, bloodhounds were brought to the still smoldering cabin. The dogs caught a scent and took off through a field and into the woods with a posse of 300 armed men hot on their heels. After traveling several miles, the hounds fetched up at the home of Silas Blankenship. Silas and his 2 sons were working in a cornfield when they saw the armed, angry mob descending on them. They took the only sensible course of action and quickly retreated to their cabin, grabbed shotguns, pointed them out the windows, and made credible threats to blow the head off anyone who came too close. After a multi-hour standoff, the Blankenships were convinced to surrender. At a preliminary hearing in the county seat of Grundy, they provided a satisfactory alibi, though none of the reports I read revealed what the alibi was. We're relying on newspaper stories for the details of this case, which are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but They are the best sources we have. An article in the next day's Alexandria Gazette put forward the theory that the murderers might have been foreigners from the coal fields. The Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency was hired to solve the case. At the time, local law enforcement lacked trained investigators and relied heavily on private detectives. Those familiar with the Baldwin Phelps Agency will recall its involvement in the coal wars. In addition to investigating crimes, the agency was also hired by companies to spy, guard property, evict tenants, and break strikes. The murders occurred on late Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning. By Sunday, September 26, Baldwin Phelps detective Alex A.C. Hufford, along with local law enforcement, had made an arrest. Howard Little was taken into custody in Bull Creek, West Virginia, where he was staying at a friend's house, approximately 6 miles from the crime scene. He was then brought to the Baldwin Phelps headquarters in Bluefield, West Virginia, where he was given a sweating. Little, a local farmer and former Ritter lumber mill foreman, was a married man with 4 children. He came under suspicion because he had been convicted of killing a man in Kentucky. He also had a wound on one of his legs, which he said was the result of his axe slipping while he was cutting some brush. Authorities believe the wound occurred during the murders. An article in the Thursday, September 30th edition of the Charleston, West Virginia Advocate stated, Little is a man of unsavory reputation, having killed a man in Pike County, Kentucky, from which he served 4 years and was pardoned by the governor. It is said that he is seldom engaged in any honest employment, and that he has been implicated in numberless bootlegging transactions. He vibrates among the 3 states, West Virginia, Virginia, and Kentucky, as the exigencies of the law demand. Further investigation only deepened the detective's suspicions. Little could not account for his whereabouts on the night of the murders, and had borrowed a .32-20 Smith & Wesson revolver from a friend a few days before the crime. On October 1st, the detectives had George Meadows' body exhumed, and physicians recovered the 2 bullets. Both had entered the abdomen, one split and penetrated to the hip bone, the other lodged in the spinal column. They weighed the bullets and found them to be within 3 grains, or 0.19 grams, of .32 caliber Winchester bullets. Authorities did not conduct a microscopic comparison of the bullets, which would not be commonplace in the United States for several more years. The comparison microscope was not invented until 1925. Each new development painted a darker portrait of Howard Little. An article in the October 3rd edition of the Richmond Times-Dispatch reported that his wife, Matilda, had given a sworn statement claiming he returned home the morning after the murders wearing bloody, torn clothes. The article also stated that she had handed over a lantern that he had brought home, a piece of evidence around which the entire case would revolve. A murder and a pardon. This seems like a good place to discuss Little's murder conviction in Pike County, Kentucky. On August 29, 1892, Kentucky Governor John Brown offered a $150 reward for the arrest of Howard Little, a fugitive wanted for murder. An item in the September 7th edition of the Newport, Kentucky Journal reported that Little was being held in the Pike County Jail, and authorities feared that his outlaw friends were planning a rescue. According to the article, guards were posted not only around the jail itself, but also along the roads leading into town. Another item, this time from the Owensboro Daily Messenger, reported that Little's father, Bill Little, slipped the jailer $200 to get the key to his son's cell, only to be caught in the act and placed under arrest. In March 1893, Howard Little received a life sentence for murder. Earlier newspaper reports say it was a brutal crime, but none give the details or context for the killing. We do not know how Jacob Kinney was killed or why. 5 years later, in March 1898, Lieutenant Governor William J. Worthington granted Little a full and free pardon. However, this pardon was part of a large group issued while Governor William O. Bradley was out of state attending the launch of the battleship USS Kentucky BB-6. This timing raises some questions about the pardon's legitimacy. A quick aside. The governor's 19-year-old daughter, Christine Bradley, a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, christened the ship with a bottle of pure spring water instead of the traditional bottle of champagne or whiskey. Fearing this would bring bad luck to the vessel, Kentuckians pelted the ship with whiskey bottles as it moved down the slipway, dousing it in bourbon. One unbroken bottle labeled Old Pepper Whiskey was recovered and is preserved at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. A disturbing development. On the night of October 31st, Halloween, 1909, 82-year-old Civil War veteran George Hood and 3 members of his family, Sarah Almeida Hood, 41, Royal Roy Hood, 27, and Emma Hood, 11, were murdered near Beckley, West Virginia. I know what you're thinking. Another family murdered 40 days after the Meadows family and about 80 miles away. Did the killer use an axe and a gun? Was the family's house set ablaze? Did they live near a railroad? As you've already surmised, the answer to all of these questions is yes. From November 4th, 1909, Raleigh Herald in Beckley, West Virginia. Early Monday morning, when the flames had died down, the 4 charred bodies were found in the debris. The legs and arms of all 4 bodies were burnt off. From the position of the bodies of George Hood Sr. and son Roy, and the evidence of fracture on the skulls of each, the murder theory is a plausible one. There was a hole in Roy's skull that appeared to be a gunshot wound. A spent bullet casing was discovered close to where the father and son were found. The bodies of Almeida and Emma were too badly burned to establish the cause of death. This brings us to The Man from the Train, a 2017 true crime book by Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James. The book explores the possibility that a serial killer traveled the United States by train, murdering more than a dozen families between 1898 and 1912. The book is well researched and makes a credible case based on the marked similarities among a series of axe murders nationwide. In most cases described in the book, the killer used the blunt side of an axe to murder his victims. If he was responsible for the Laurel Creek and Beckley murders, then using a gun would represent a departure from his usual method. The Laurel Creek and Hood family murders were among the cases that James and his daughter believe were most likely the work of the man from the train. In fact, the very first chapter of the book, titled The Bloody Penny, focuses on the Laurel Creek case. Little had reportedly bought a newspaper with a blood-stained penny, and this led to his arrest. This part of the story may have been apocryphal, as the penny, blood-stained or otherwise, could not have placed him at the crime scene. Bill James, in Chapter 35, entitled Hurley, makes a strong case that the Meadows family murder is the work of this prolific serial killer. From the book, I absolutely believe that the man from the train committed this crime. It is too good a match for the other Southern crimes for that not to be true in my opinion. And also, B, the case against Howard Little seems to me to be flimsy. And C, the case seems to be almost certainly connected to the murders of the Hood family 6 weeks later and 80 miles away. The trial of Howard Little. Howard Little's trial for the murders of Aunt Betty Justus and the Meadows family began on November 25, 1909, in Grundy, Virginia. The Commonwealth attempted to get Little's wife on the witness stand, but defense counsel objected and the judge sustained their objection. 3 witnesses gave compelling testimony, one that appeared to place him at the scene of the crime, and 2 that supported the prosecution's argument that the motive for the crime was robbery. The main witness against Little was Mary Lee, a woman who lived with the Little family. She testified that Little was absent from the house on the night of the murders, and that when he returned the next morning, he had a lantern which belonged to George Meadows. She was able to identify it by the wick, which was made from a piece of a felt hat. None of the newspaper articles explained why Mary Lee was living with the family. She may have been a relative, a housekeeper, or one of those annoying Airbnb squatters who rent a room for the weekend and never leave. One thing is certain, her online review of Howard Little would have been 1 star or lower. Mary Stacy, Little's married girlfriend, told the court that he had given her $20 the day before the murders to buy clothes for a trip out west. He said they would go once he retrieved the money he had deposited in the bank at Bluefield. Betty Justus's son, Sennett, testified that when he worked with Little at the Ritter Lumber Company, Little had asked him several times how much money his mother kept in her home. Little did not take the stand in his own defense. Instead, he relied on his attorney's cross-examination of the witnesses. It was a bold strategy, Cotton, and it did not pay off for Little. On Sunday, November 28th, the jury returned a verdict of first-degree murder, and Little was sentenced to electrocution. On February 11th, 1910, Howard Little, 38, became the 23rd person executed in Virginia's electric chair. He never confessed to the crime. The Hood murders near Beckley, West Virginia, were never solved. After arresting and interrogating Admeta's boyfriend, Mike Farrell, and 2 members of his railroad section crew, the investigation ran out of steam and suspects. A July 1910 newspaper article reported that detectives were still working on the Hood family murders. Investigators claimed to have established that exactly 5 people were involved in the crime. The perceived motive had shifted from robbery to revenge, then back to robbery. A wild rumor that a jailed black man named Luther Sherman, who had lived near the Hoods, confessed to the crimes, was dismissed as false. Despite the detective's stated confidence, the article is one of the last I could find about the murders. Bill James mentions in The Man from the Train that at one point detectives consulted a psychic named Elizabeth Blake about the murders. Gravestones and yellowed newspapers. The 2 mass murders were tied together by a final and somewhat eerie coincidence. Betty Justus and George Hood each lie beneath the largest, most prominent monument in their respective cemeteries. Betty's gravestone actually names Howard Little as the killer. This is the second case I've come across where the killer is mentioned on the victim's grave marker. The first was Hermit David Greer in The Killer and the Philosopher episode. As is often the case when researching century-old crimes based on newspaper articles, there remains almost as many questions as answers. Did Howard Little kill Betty Justus and the Meadows family? Or did a drifting serial killer riding the railroads of turn-of-the-century America murder both the Meadows and the Hood families? And if the man from the train wasn't involved, then who killed the Hood family, and why? Occam's razor, a problem-solving principle, states that the simplest explanation is usually your best bet. Unfortunately, in this case, I'm not sure which theory is simpler, 1 killer or 2 killers. I have no satisfactory conclusion for you, other than to say that the similarity and proximity of the 2 mass murders bothers me a lot. Editor's note: there are several blogs and podcasts that mention the claim that Howard Little showed up at Aunt Betty's cabin on the night of the murders, asked to stay overnight, and was let in by the family. However, no contemporary account supports this. From his arrest to being strapped into the electric chair, Little claimed that he was not there that night. Everyone in the cabin was killed, and no eyewitness saw him at the crime scene. The claim can be found on a genealogy webpage by Robert M. Baker, one of Aunt Betty's descendants, who cites Nancy Virginia Baker's 1976 book, Bountiful and Beautiful, A Bicentennial History of Buchanan County. I mean, no disrespect to Robert Baker or the family, but every article I can find indicates that the lantern was what linked Little to the murders. Robert Baker also references the July 1935 issue of Master Detective magazine and a lore and legend column by Sam Varney Jr. published in The Mountaineer. I have been unable to find these sources. If you know where I can find copies or PDFs of them, please email me at blueridgetruecrime@gmail.com. I'll leave a link to Robert Baker's webpage in the show notes. Check it out. If you want to hear more true crime stories from these ridges and coves, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the next case. That's it for this episode of the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast. Check the show notes for links to the Blue Ridge True Crime Substack and YouTube channel, and any story-related links. Until next time, I'll look for you on the back roads.